folks, the dark before the dawn of the start of Exodus, we talked about how Israel got to Egypt last time we met, which was weeks and weeks ago. And let's just jump into the story. So here is my outline for the book of Exodus. It is not inspired by the Holy Spirit. It is John looking at the book. So we have the first two chapters are what we're going to cover today, the days of oppression. Then come the days of deliverance. Then God's providence in the wilderness. A key element, and you'll notice it doesn't say 10 Commandments in chapter 20. It says covenant, because the 10 Commandments are part of the covenant. One of the reasons that this Lutheran pastor theologian just pulls his hair out when somebody was like, we're going to put the 10 Commandments in school. And I'm like, are you going to teach it in context, or are you just going to drop the 10 Commandments? And they're like, 10 Commandments. And I'm like, no. 10 Commandments are part of a much larger story. You know, it's kind of like saying, we're just going to teach, the Civil War, and we're going to ignore all the rest of American history. It doesn't tell the whole story. You're a pagan. No, I'm not a pagan. I'm a devout Christian. I just want the whole story told, not just... And then finally, the summary of it is how, now that we live in covenant with God, how do we live as God's covenant people? There we go. So we talked about this last time, the oppression that changed, that then came a new Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. God's people go from being favored status to threat, because the new Pharaoh says, we will other these people, make them the enemy, and that's how I'll consolidate power. That's my political reading of the opening of Exodus. God's promise to Abraham of offspring more than stars in the sky is being fulfilled. Probably, I've read this in more than one place from reasonable scholars. What we are seeing here is the hardscrabble life of living as shepherds and constantly following your flock didn't really allow God's people the leisure to really have a bunch of kids. When they moved to Egypt, where there was more agriculture, more food, settled way of life, their families just exploded. So O.P. Kretzmann, a famous Lutheran from two generations before me, so really unknown now, but I like this quote from him. Tribulations and persecution are the lot of the people of God, but such crosses bring blessing and gain. That kind of is going to summarize how we're going to handle these first two chapters. The hardship is real, but God is using it for a better, greater purpose. So the king of Egypt said to the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, if you see it's a baby boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let it live. This was what I preached on 3 weeks ago. This Pharaoh is not real bright that we're dealing with. He continually makes decisions based on kind of an impetuousness or his thinking, and he doesn't think all the way through. The idea of killing all males is to reduce the fighting force. But what is the Pharaoh also using the Israelites for? Work. So what's he also effectively doing? Killing his labor force. And it's like, which do you want? He just can't think strategically, and it gets ridiculous how badly he loses because he can't think. He just is incapable of it. We covered this 3 weeks ago. Midwives, however, fear God, don't do what the king told them to do. They let the boys live. Why have you done this? And the response is, the midwives feared God. I grew up with Luther's Small Catechism, and in most explanations, We should fear, love, and trust God above all things, is the first commandment. And then remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not. And then goes on from there. All through the commandments, there's this because we fear God. When I preached 3 weeks ago, we talked about judge for yourself from Peter and John. Should I serve you? Should I serve God? Who do you think is more important? The fear that in the small catechism, this is not the word I learned when I was going through confirmation. This is not a servile fear of a slave fearing being whipped. This is the fear that I had growing up of not wanting to disappoint my parents. So it was like, I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I didn't want them to go like, oh, he's our kid. And so as a result, I behaved in certain ways. Had some interesting stories from my brother who didn't have that same fear. And some of the things that happened in the house when my parents were gone. What?
He was an example.
He was an excellent example of what not to do. Now, interesting enough, that was the brother who, in those years, right, 18 or 14 to 30, was like, oh, dear God. And then he's the one that's there taking care at the end, right? And has changed his life to take care of his mom and dad. And literally picked jobs based on, I need to be available to take dad to the VA. I can't take that job. And it's like, boy, people change. We sure do.
What kind of work does he do?
He was a handyman. He had worked, so he got through like 2 years of college. It was not for him, but he's real good with his hands. And then he went off and lived semi-nomadically for a while. And then eventually came back and started working at the Sheboygan Glass Company, which is the company my dad managed. He was a part owner, but he was not the founder. And then my dad retired. The owner's son came over, ran the business right into the dirt, and my brother ended up unemployed and decided instead of going to work for somebody else, he was going to work for himself. And he was good. He was really, he builds things beautifully. And that's what he did for the rest of his life. This is my favorite fear passage from the Bible. Jesus, talking to people like you and me, his followers, says, don't be afraid of those who can merely kill you. And after that, can't do anything else. What you should fear is God, the one who, after you die, could still send you to hell. Yes, fear him. And then he immediately goes into, but remember about this God that you're supposed to fear. 5 sparrows are sold for a penny, but not one of them gets harmed without God knowing about it. The very hairs on your head are numbered. So this God knows you intimately, loves you deeply. This is the one that you need to fear. This is it. Now, I will take time to tell you a family story and process something. Wonder what I did there. Got to Sheboygan working. My brother and I are working together, cleaning out. We're doing the heavy lifting because my other brother is 76 and not in great health. And he's like, this is working really well. So for 2 days, we are moving, we're cleaning, we're hauling, and we're fixing things. Then my sister, who normally runs all things, shows up. And if you've ever been in a church where you had, or maybe a boss, I'm used to churches where I've seen pastors who they want things done a particular way, but they can't articulate it, but they can only come and criticize you when you don't do it their way, but they don't tell you what it is until after you have failed at doing it. That's my sister. And so we would, and this used to drive me crazy, right? And then I just finally decided this time I'm not going to let it make me crazy. And I just let her go through and go, well, no, not this, not this, not this. Well, okay. And I was like, and so finally we would get into an area that Ted and I had worked on, and I go, how can this be improved? And she sort of looked at me like, yeah, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to fight you. Okay, I'm just not. I know you're expecting it. I'm just not going to do it. So it was an interesting time in family dynamics. As a result, we all got along. We had a family meal, and on the drive home, Judy and I were saying, well, do you think we'll see? There's some of them we'll definitely see again, but it's like, if we're going to see them again, it's going to be up to us to drive back there or get back there because, we've lived here 27 years and they visited once. So the midwives, they just throw shade on Pharaoh, which lets you know the level of competence that even the midwives who fear, are in a position of subjugation are like, yeah, well, Pharaoh, they're not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Yeah.
Some low-level midwife jumped 23 layers of management to get to Pharaoh himself.
I think Pharaoh called him in, right? I don't remember the name of the guy, but there was a story at Ford where there was some low-level engineer who ran some numbers and went, uh-oh, we got trouble, okay? And reported up his chain of command and said, this car is going to fall apart if we do X, Y, or Z. And the reason I remember it was because of the great illustration, and it said, and suddenly, like the parting of the Red Sea, all the layers of management opened up until this one guy could walk into Ford's office and say, sir, my numbers tell me this. And he shortly thereafter was a senior VP because they were like, this guy will speak truth to power, and and we're not going to risk our jobs and bring bad news to the boss. So I'm thinking that's what happened is, Pharaoh was like, how come there's still Hebrew boy? Everybody was like, whoa, you want to talk to Shiphrah and Puah? I have no idea what happened, sir. And poof, they got hauled up into the throne room, and they're like, what can we tell you? Egyptian women. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, isn't it funny? He's like, yeah. Now, keep in mind, who's writing the story? Under the power of the Holy Spirit, of course. But, they're scoring a little point, people increase, become more numerous, and God even gives the midwives families of their own. So Shiphrah and Puah think God is greater than Pharaoh and live according to their conviction. The Bible says of them, God honors them with families. So you kind of think of, they became moms. They had kids. The Hebrew actually says they got houses. But this does not mean they got real estate. This means they got dynasties. So when God would speak of David, he would say, for David and the sake of his house. He was not talking about the palace. He was talking about David's extended long-term family, generation to generation. So evidently Shiphrah and Puah, because of their faithfulness to God, are given dynasties. That there are people who, generations later are like, here it's like, my ancestors came over on the Mayflower. Back then it would have been like, my great-great-grandmother was Shiphrah. Oh, okay, you're from that tribe. I get it. You are a person not to be trifled with. So that's what the Bible is trying to communicate here. That God said, these people are faithful, and I want their tribe to increase. So that this kind of faithfulness that says, I'm going to put my trust in God above all things, I'm going to bless that. Personally, I think this is what happens in churches. That as churches faithfully carry out the mission of God of making disciples, God blesses churches like that, and they grow. I'm not saying that churches that shrink are necessarily are not faithful, but I am telling you that resources tend to follow mission. I have a friend who's in just a tough situation. It's a former, 3 generations ago, it was, a white Lutheran, neighborhood, and everybody left, and the church is still there. And they wanted to hang on to it because it's a historic church in this town. And he is trying mightily to figure out, how do I reach these new neighbors? And he's like the third guy to try, because the first two guys were like, we have no clue how to reach these people. We're just going to hope that people keep driving in from the suburbs and come to because we have the big pipe organ and everything else. And eventually those generations in the suburbs died. Their grandkids don't know historic such and such. And so now Dave is really trying to make this work. And it's like, we're Facebook friends. He's a classmate from seminary. And I'm like, man, he is facing struggles like you wouldn't believe. Do I believe he's being faithful? Yes. Do I think his church is growing? Yes. But it doesn't look at all like the way God is working here at Christ our Savior. It's a very different kind of growth. But it's a dynasty.
He needs a sprinkler day and invite the neighborhood kids.
He does things like that all the time. I mean, and this is also the kind of neighborhood where it's like the blessing of the backpacks is like, these are the only school supplies these kids are going to get. When he does a sprinkler day and there's free food, it's like big news in the neighborhood because it's a tough, hard neighborhood. So, yeah, and he's plugging away at it and doing great stuff. But it's like, he's like, thanks be to God, Bob from so-and-so came in and fixed our heating or fixed our boiler for the umpteenth time, and it's duct tape, that's holding it together. But he's growing the church, but it doesn't look like our church. Pharaoh gave this order to all the people. Every Hebrew boy, now we jump into where I'm preaching today, throw into the Nile, let the girls live. And so he can't get traction for the genocidal plan where he tried to send it down through official channels. Have the midwives kill the babies. That didn't work. Perhaps because everybody's looking at it, including his own officers, and going, if we want slave labor, we got to have males. We can't just kill everybody and then say at the same time we're going to have what we want. So he does let's turn to the general populace. And you'll notice he does not give permission. This is a command. You will, every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. And exposure to the elements to kill infants was a common thing. We've talked about this before, how the early church, one of the things they did that grew that church was they looked at their environment and said, wow, people are throwing all these babies out. We think babies are a gift from God. We will bring them in. We will raise them in the church. We will take care of them. And surprise, surprise, the church grew. Because I had a family in Louisiana who was Lutheran. Why were they Lutheran? Because mom and dad died on the boat over, and grandma was taken into a Lutheran orphanage in New Orleans. And as a result, her granddaughter, who was not a young woman at that time, in my congregation was like, well, that's how our family became Lutheran, She had no idea what her ancestry was prior to that because her parents were dead, right? But her identity, these were the people who took care of me, and as a result, this is who our family is. That's how that dynasty worked. We jump into Exodus chapter 2 now. So this is what we had in church this morning. We'll skip the reading. So in some ways, though, I do want to say that this normalcy of life, they're living under this edict. They are no longer favored people. The Pharaoh is now exploiting them. He is using them for slave labor. He is making their lives bitter. He is trying to do genocide. And a man and a woman decide to get married and start a family, which is this kind of bold act of defiance in the face of all of this, of just saying, no, we're going to just do, like God said, be fruitful and multiply. We're going to do it. So Jesus says this. I didn't use this in the sermon because I wanted to go in a different direction. And I went with peculiar instead of shrewd. What was the rule from Pharaoh? What did you have to do with babies? Throw them in the Nile. What did Moses' mom do? She threw him in the Nile. She just threw him in a basket that would float. And I'm guessing she also put it in a peculiar place where she was thinking, yeah, maybe this will get found. It's kind of like right now in Colorado, there's what do they call the situation? You have a baby, you're overwhelmed, and you don't leave it just on the steps of the church because sometimes babies die there. What are those called? Yeah, you take them to the fire department, right? And you can just turn.
There's usually a little.
Yeah, and you can turn it in, and it sets
off an alarm inside.
right, and they come get the baby. Yeah, so she trusts God in this, that He would take care of her son. Faith will try daring things, and she shrewdly said, "Well, I'll take what steps I can, and then I'm going to have to trust God with the outcome. I can't foresee it all, but I am going to send his big sister to watch over him. Now, a question we can't answer. Do you think they were being daringly heroic or just desperate? Yeah. And there is just a radical heroism of simply following Jesus, of loving God above all things, of choosing to love your neighbor above yourself. A pastor I respect makes it a point to do something difficult every day, something that he does not want to do. He says, this keeps me humble, keeps me dependent on God, and it forces me to live my faith. Because if I live in an area, if I make my life comfortable, I can ignore God. There's a Bible passage in Proverbs that says, God, I don't make me so poor that I'm tempted to steal and therefore bring disgrace to your name. But also don't make me so rich that I'm tempted to forget all about you because I think I've got it all worked out. And this guy's not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but he was like, that passage spoke to me, and I said, I think my wealth isn't money, but it's this, I can make a comfortable life where it would just be me and church people, and we get along, more or less, and but he said, I intentionally put myself out and do something difficult every day to make sure that I am absolutely dependent on God, and it keeps my faith growing. Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the river to bathe. Hence why I think they knew where to put the basket. And his sister, shall I get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby? Yes, go. They get the baby's mother. Take the baby, nurse him, I'll pay you. She named him Moses. I drew him out of the water. They felt sorry for the crying baby is literally she had compassion. She had, in her heart, she had a feeling for this baby. And guessing that the crying is a sign of hunger, Miriam, that's Moses' sister, pops up with the equivalent of a baby bottle. I know a wet nurse. Would you like somebody to nurse that baby for you? And so God's peculiar plan has Moses' own parents raising their child and getting paid to do it for the first years of his life. And this is the same guy who will one day stand before Pharaoh, this one or another one, I'm not sure which, and say, let my people go. So we've talked before about the incompetence of this Pharaoh. I used a different word, impotence here. Pharaoh versus the midwives. Who won that one? Midwives. Pharaoh versus the Israelite moms, or at least Moses' mom. Yeah, mom wins. Pharaoh versus Moses' family. Moses' family wins. Pharaoh versus his own daughter. His own daughter ends up on God's side and helping Moses come along. All through this thing, God is continually showing, I'm in charge. Yes, this guy is making your life miserable. It's for a short time. I will be there. I will rescue you. I don't think it was easy for the people going through the struggle that saw themselves go from favored status to feared, and going from like they had a normal life to becoming enslaved. for them, it looked like this is going to be forever. And they probably were doing the, where is God? What are we going to do? This is horrible. You and I, with the ability to look back over time, can say, no, God is at work here. And yes, there's going to be this period of darkness, this period of hardship, but it's not all there is. There is going to be light coming, and there is going to be you're going to end up in a better place by going through this. And it's such a basic human principle. But boy, I'm looking at my country right now, and I'm just watching people who are watching their status change, and they are just having such a hard time with it. And I'm saying, it's okay. Don't get me wrong, it's not fun. But the world is changing, and it's going to be difficult. But God's still in charge. God is still God. So do what you can, but you're going to have to trust the outcome to God. And be careful what else you might fall for in the process. So Moses' name, in Egyptian, his name was Musha. It means delivered out of water. Hebrew is the wordplay of Moshesh, to draw out, but it also carries the connotation of deliverer. So his name, given to him by Pharaoh's daughter, is prophetic. That when she picks the baby up out of the water and says, I'm going to name him Mushish because I drew him out of the water. What God is doing is she's picking him up and saying, I'm going to name this baby Deliverer because he is going to deliver his people. And she doesn't even realize what she's saying because God's at work. Now, one day after Moses had grown up, this is next Sunday's sermon, so if you want to skip church, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So Moses at 40, Stephen, when he's preaching before he gets stoned to death in Acts chapter 8, summarized it this way. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. So Moses was raised at home for a certain amount of time, probably until he was weaned, and then was raised in the Egyptian palace as a son of the daughter of Pharaoh. So nobility. Nevertheless, somehow he is still identifying and is being identified as being Hebrew, as being Israelite. So it must have been a very peculiar life for him, that you're one of us, but you're not one of us. But at the same time, he's familiar with all the inner workings of how a system works. God was doing a lot of prep work at this point. So Moses' faith gets described in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, when Moses had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with God's people rather than enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. So Hebrews is preaching. He's and you look back at the end of Moses' life and you can say, yeah, this is all true. I'm not sure at 40 he sees the whole picture yet. He knows who he is. He knows who his ancestors were. He identifies with them. But nevertheless, he does have to face that struggle of, will I side with the Egyptian side and become comfortable and live as a prince of Egypt, or will I side with my mom and dad's people, my people? And that's the choice that Moses has to make, and he makes it at 40, and he chooses to identify with his people. So he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Looking this way and that, he kills the Egyptian, hides him in the sand, and then next day he goes out, sees two Hebrews fighting, and he asks one of them, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? So glancing this way and that, God's work does not need secrecy. If you think it needs secrecy, you're not doing God's work. I'm not saying there's not a time where we're not private. When I hear a confession, that is intentionally not public. That is something that I take seriously. But at the same time, it's not like, okay, we're not going to tell anybody what we're doing, but we're going to do this and this and this, and then suddenly spring it all on them and they won't have a choice. That's not the work of God. It could be that you might say as an adult, hey, we're not going to tell the kids all of this because we're not sure yet. For example, right now we have a call committee looking for my replacement. They are doing phone interviews after they have read documents provided by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, provided by the pastors themselves. And they have sorted these things. They've read the documents. They've prayed over them. They've looked over them. But you'll notice they're not giving blow-by-blow reports and coming to you and saying, okay, we talked to this guy, and we like this, this, and this, but we thought this guy was, and then this, and this. They're just kind of, we're trusting them with that process because at the end, they may go through 5 or 6 different things that they're aware of that they can't bring the whole group along. Now, eventually they will come and they will say, okay, we have interviewed, we've read, we have talked, we have prayed. We think Bob is the best possible candidate. Will you approve Bob? And as a congregation, you get to ask questions and we get to say, what about this and how about that? Yes, thank you, we asked about that. Thank you for bringing that up. Or, no, we didn't think about that. Okay, what about this? And we know this, we don't know that. And then we get to decide, yes, let's extend a call to Bob, or let's not. And then typically what happens is Bob comes and hopefully brings his spouse, and we visit, we talk more, and then the deliberation goes on and a decision gets made. So that's the process, and that's what I don't mean secrecy is like, that's just a private thing right now because there's too many moving parts. Jesus does say, remember folks, if you try to conceal it, it will not, it's going to be made known. Oh, okay. I'll save it for next week when I'm actually preaching on this. Thank you for your attention. It's good to be back in the saddle. I appreciate your gracious with you. Good to be back. I'll see you upstairs if you have any questions.